Ever since I moved into my new house, life was peaceful, until the HOA started causing trouble. They claimed the narrow strip of grass at the edge of my property was some kind of shared pathway, and soon enough they were marching across it at all hours. I tried reasoning with them, but every time I spoke the HOA Karen would roll her eyes and mutter under her breath. One morning I stepped outside to water my lawn and saw them yet again trampling my freshly planted flowers like they owned the place. My blood boiled. This was my property, my space, and no one was going to disrespect it like that. I tried polite warnings. I put up little signs. I even talked to neighbors, hoping someone would back me up, but Karen just laughed and said the rules didn't apply to her. That's when I realized polite methods weren't going to work. I needed a plan, a clever, harmless surprise that would finally teach her a lesson without landing me in legal trouble. For the next few days, I watched her routine closely, noting the exact times she and her friends cut across my lawn. I mapped every shortcut, memorized every step, and began preparing a setup that would make her stop in her tracks the moment she crossed onto my grass again. I kept the plan simple but cunning. First, I bought a motion-activated sprinkler and a cheap outdoor camera that sent alerts to my phone. I wanted something unmistakable and harmless, no traps, no damage, just an embarrassing interruption that would make them think twice. Next, I designed the visual, a brand new, professionally printed sign that read "Private Property No Trespassing" in bold letters, placed where the shortcut began, and right beside it a smaller sign that said "Smile, you are on camera." I practiced my timing, testing the sprinkler at different angles so it would soak anyone who cut across the narrow patch but leave the rest of the lawn and plants untouched. On the day I was ready, I set the camera to record and hid behind the hedges with my phone in my hand. I could feel my heart thumping, a weird mix of adrenaline and ridiculous pride. At first, nothing happened, just birds and the distant hum of lawnmowers, then like clockwork they came, Karen leading the charge with that familiar smirk. She barely glanced at the new signs. Her heel hit the grass and the sprinkler woke up with a perfect arc. Water exploded through the air like a small, polite fountain right in her path. Karen squealed, stepping back, and her friends scattered while I tried not to laugh out loud. That was only the opening move. As she shook water from her blouse, the camera pinged my phone and I hit play on a hidden Bluetooth speaker that I had tucked behind a garden statue. A pre-recorded message I had made earlier, light-hearted but firm, played across the yard: "Please respect private property. This is a friendly neighborhood reminder." The message made the whole thing feel official, not like a personal attack, and for a second Karen looked genuinely flustered. Her cheeks flushed a bright, indignant red. Neighbors peered from porches, curious, and a few even clapped when Karen marched off muttering about rules and decency. I watched the recording later and felt a strange satisfaction. It wasn't vengeance so much as a reset, a clear line drawn across my grass. But as I patted myself on the back, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number and the subject line read, "I think we need to talk." The mysterious message on my phone threw me completely off balance. My finger hovered over the screen, heart pounding. Who would text me about a harmless sprinkler prank? It wasn't signed, and the number was unfamiliar, but the words sent a shiver down my spine. Nice setup on the lawn, but Karen doesn't take this lightly. Expect a visit. At first, I wanted to ignore it, thinking it was just someone trolling me. But a deep part of me knew this was serious. Karen was vindictive, petty, and unpredictable. She didn't just complain, she escalated. I had to be ready. I spent the next hour pacing, checking my cameras, testing the sprinkler one last time, and making sure my phone and all my devices were fully charged. Every instinct screamed at me, this wasn't over yet. Later that afternoon, there was a knock at my door. My stomach sank. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and opened it cautiously. There she stood, Karen herself, hands on her hips, the same smirk of entitlement plastered across her face. She glanced at my signs, then at the damp, glittering lawn, and her expression twisted from smugness to irritation to shock as she realized what had happened. "This is outrageous," she snapped, her voice sharp. "You have no right to humiliate me like this." I smiled, keeping my tone calm, almost casual. "Karen, I just wanted to make sure everyone understood the property boundaries. It's nothing personal." I hoped my calm demeanor would diffuse her aggression, but I could see the gears turning in her head, plotting some kind of comeback. She glared at the signs, then back at me. "Nothing personal," she echoed, voice dripping with sarcasm. "You've made a fool out of me in front of the neighborhood. Do you realize what you've done?" I tried not to flinch. "It's just a reminder, Karen. Everyone deserves their property respected, including me." She scoffed. "You think a silly sprinkler and a sign can stop me? You haven't seen anything yet." I could feel the tension rising in the air. She was furious, and I was secretly thrilled. I had gotten under her skin, exactly where I wanted. But there was still a lingering sense of unease. That anonymous message hadn't been a joke, and I knew Karen had connections, people who could complicate things if I wasn't careful. As she ranted, I noticed her phone buzz on the table behind her. She glanced down, and her face suddenly froze. Her usual confidence faltered, and for a fleeting moment, I saw something I hadn't expected: vulnerability. I tried to catch a glimpse of the screen, but she quickly snatched her phone away and glanced around as if paranoid. My curiosity was killing me. What had she seen? Was it another camera angle? A neighbor finally recording her? Or maybe she had realized just how many people had witnessed her repeated disrespect of property lines? Trying to keep the conversation under control, I asked her a simple but pointed question: "Do you really think this behavior is fair to everyone in the neighborhood?" Her silence spoke volumes. She opened her mouth to reply, then closed it, searching for words. Every rebuttal seemed inadequate under the weight of what had already happened: the sprinkler, the camera, the signs, the neighbors watching from their porches. The more she faltered, the more I realized that this wasn't just a prank anymore, it was a lesson in accountability. Karen tried to recover her composure, pacing back and forth like a caged animal, muttering about rules and fairness. "I pay HOA fees. I have rights. You can't just," she trailed off, clearly flustered, and I had to fight the urge to smile. I could almost see the mental gears grinding inside her head, trying to plot revenge or rationalize her behavior. But it wasn't working. My setup, the harmless but humiliating sprinkler, the signs, the recording, was airtight. She had no leg to stand on. Meanwhile, I glanced toward the street. A few neighbors had stopped what they were doing and were peeking over fences or windows. Some were clearly amused, others just curious. A few even smiled knowingly at me. That was when I realized something profound: this wasn't just about Karen or me anymore. It had become a quiet neighborhood spectacle, a public reckoning for someone who had repeatedly ignored boundaries. Karen noticed the neighbors too and quickly became defensive, pointing at me. "They're all watching you. You've turned them against me," she accused, voice rising. I simply nodded, letting the truth speak for itself. "It's not about turning anyone against you. It's about standing up for what's fair." Her eyes narrowed. She was furious but trapped. The signs were clear, the camera evidence was undeniable, and the neighbors had seen everything. Just when I thought the confrontation had reached its peak, Karen's tone shifted slightly. She leaned in, lowering her voice but still loud enough for me to hear. "You think this is over? You're going to regret this." I held her gaze steadily. If respecting property is something to regret, then I guess I'll wear that regret proudly. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for the first time, I sensed hesitation. Then came the next unexpected twist. Another message appeared on my phone, this time from the same unknown number: "She's more dangerous than you think. Watch closely." I felt a jolt of adrenaline. Karen wasn't just a petty HOA member anymore, she might escalate beyond what I had imagined. I quickly thought through contingencies: keep the cameras rolling, ensure the sprinkler was still active, and maybe, just maybe, get a few neighbors to quietly stay nearby. The thought of a dramatic showdown with Karen in my front yard was nerve-wracking but thrilling. As if on cue, Karen stomped her foot and muttered something under her breath, pacing in frustration. "This isn't fair. I can't believe this." I stayed calm, letting her anger simmer. I didn't interrupt, didn't explain further. I wanted her to realize on her own that her actions had consequences, and the public exposure of her behavior would speak louder than anything I said. For a long few minutes, she stared at the damp lawn, the sprinkler, and the signs. Then, in a surprising move, she walked slowly toward the edge of the property and paused, clearly debating whether to cross again. I held my breath, fingers twitching as I prepared to activate the sprinkler if she dared to step onto the grass again. The tension in the air was palpable, every neighbor watching, every leaf on the trees seeming to hold its breath, every bird suddenly silent. Finally, she backed away, muttering angrily, and stormed off toward the street. I exhaled slowly, feeling a rush of relief and exhilaration. I had managed to stand my ground, assert my property rights, and make a public statement, all without causing harm or escalating into something ugly. But even as Karen disappeared from view, I knew this wasn't the end. The anonymous warnings, her unpredictable nature, and her tendency to escalate meant the next chapter was still coming, and I had to be ready. I spent the rest of the day reviewing the camera footage, sending backup clips to neighbors who wanted to see the proof, and thinking through the next steps. Karen had underestimated me, underestimated the neighbors, and underestimated the community's patience. That miscalculation would work in my favor, but only if I stayed sharp. I set reminders to check the lawn, adjusted the sprinkler angles, and even thought about planting subtle obstacles along the usual shortcut path. By nightfall, the yard was quiet again, the signs illuminated softly in the fading light, and the camera silently recording the empty lawn. I sat on my porch, sipping a cup of tea, feeling a mix of triumph and nervous anticipation. Karen might come back, she might plot something else, but I was ready. And as I stared at the damp grass glistening under the porch light, I couldn't help but smile. She had learned, in her own stubborn way, that crossing boundaries, literally, had consequences. And yet, the thrill of what was to come, the ultimate surprise I still had in mind, lingered in my mind. This confrontation was only part of the story. Karen had no idea what I was planning next, and when the final act unfolded, it would be a moment she, and the entire neighborhood, would never forget. The first lesson had landed, but the second, bigger one was coming, and I was ready to make sure it was unforgettable. The morning sunlight streamed across my lawn, glinting off the sprinkler and the signs I had carefully placed. I knew today would be the real test. Karen had already been humiliated by the harmless prank, but I wanted the final act to send a clear, undeniable message, not just to her, but to the entire neighborhood. It wasn't about revenge, it was about respect, boundaries, and showing that entitlement and arrogance couldn't simply override everyone else's property rights. I could feel my pulse quicken as I set up the final part of my plan. I had invited a few trusted neighbors to come outside under the pretense of a small, garden celebration. I didn't tell them what exactly would happen, I just wanted them present to witness and support the moment. By 8 a.m., a small crowd had gathered, leaning on fences, peering from porches, and whispering quietly among themselves. Some had coffee cups in hand, others had their phones out, ready to record the spectacle. The excitement was palpable, and I could see a few smiles directed my way. They had been tired of Karen's constant shortcuts, ignoring property boundaries, and disrespectful behavior. Today, they would finally get to see justice in action. I checked my phone one last time to make sure the sprinkler and camera system were fully operational. Every angle was covered, every possible escape route monitored. Then I positioned a small tablet on a tripod, preloaded with footage of Karen walking across my lawn over the past several days, multiple takes, timestamps, and clear audio from the small motion camera I had installed. The plan was simple: show her own actions on full display to the neighborhood, backed by the evidence of the cameras and her repeated disregard for my property. I could see her approaching from the street. She strutted confidently, probably expecting another solo confrontation, but her expression faltered as soon as she noticed the growing crowd. Her smirk wavered as she caught sight of the tablet screen glowing in the sunlight, and then her eyes locked on the signs and the glistening lawn. I could almost hear her mental calculations racing. She had underestimated this, just as she always did, and now the momentum had shifted entirely. The moment she stepped closer, I tapped the play button on the tablet. Instantly, the screen displayed footage of her trampling my lawn, ignoring the private property and "smile you are on camera" signs. I heard murmurs ripple through the crowd. She stopped dead in her tracks, jaw tight, hands clenched at her sides. What is this?" she stammered, trying to regain her composure. I kept my voice calm, projecting confidence and authority. "This is just a reminder, Karen, of how repeated disregard for property affects everyone around you. These videos are timestamps of the incidents I've been talking about." Karen's face flushed a deep red. She looked around at the neighbors, who were now leaning in closer, whispering among themselves. Some were shaking their heads in disbelief, others trying to suppress laughter at the irony of the situation. She opened her mouth to argue, but I raised a hand gently. "Let the footage speak for itself," I said. Her eyes flicked between me and the screen, and I could see that for the first time, she realized her usual tactics, bluster, entitlement, shouting, wouldn't work. "Not here. Not now." I began walking slowly toward her, speaking clearly so everyone could hear. "Karen, this isn't about personal attacks or humiliating anyone. It's about setting boundaries and respecting shared spaces. Everyone in this neighborhood deserves that. You've ignored the rules repeatedly, and now the community is seeing what we've been dealing with." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. The crowd murmured their agreement. A few neighbors even clapped softly, subtly reinforcing the point. Karen tried to regain control, pointing a finger at me. "This is ridiculous. You can't just drag me into this in front of everyone. It's not fair." Her voice cracked slightly, betraying her frustration. I shook my head. "The fairness comes from following the rules, Karen. The fairness comes from respecting others. The sprinkler was harmless, the signs were clear, and this footage is undeniable. What's unfair is thinking you can ignore boundaries because you feel entitled." Her gaze flicked nervously toward the neighbors. I could see her realizing that she no longer had an audience that supported her. She wasn't in charge here anymore. The community had collectively decided that behavior like hers wasn't acceptable. Some neighbors stepped forward, calmly recounting their own experiences with her ignoring property lines or shortcuts through private lawns. One elderly man, Mr. Chen, who had lived 3 houses down for 20 years, said, "We've all been patient, Karen, but there's a limit. Today, we're showing that everyone's property matters." Her eyes widened in disbelief. She tried to interrupt, but every attempt was politely shut down by the neighbor's quiet authority. I could feel the tension in the air, a strange mix of triumph and suspense. Karen had been exposed in the most public and undeniable way possible. For once, she had no easy way to turn the blame, no angry retorts that carried weight. Her only option was to leave, something I knew she was considering but would resist because of her pride. I could see her face contorting with frustration. Finally, she muttered, "This isn't over. You think this ends today, but it doesn't." I didn't respond. I simply gestured toward the lawn, now pristine again after a brief watering session, and toward the neighbors, silently showing that the community had my back. Her gaze flicked from person to person, and I could sense that for the first time, she felt truly isolated. The power dynamic had shifted, and she realized it. Then, almost theatrically, she turned and stormed off toward the street, muttering under her breath. Some neighbors whispered, some chuckled quietly, and others simply shook their heads. I stood in the yard, letting the scene settle. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a deep sense of satisfaction. I hadn't just won a personal battle, I had created a moment that reminded everyone of fairness, boundaries, and the importance of standing up for yourself. After Karen left, the neighbors gathered around to help replant the few flowers that had been trampled in the past week. There was laughter, casual conversation, and even light teasing about the sprinkler prank. I realized then that the best part of the whole plan wasn't the embarrassment of Karen, it was the way it brought the community together. People who had merely nodded in passing at each other were now sharing stories, exchanging gardening tips, and quietly building bonds that had been dormant for years. The sprinkler remained in place for a week, a cheeky but harmless reminder of the lesson learned. The camera continued to record, not as a threat, but as a silent guardian ensuring the property boundaries were respected. Karen, predictably, avoided the shortcut entirely after that day. She would occasionally glare from across the street, but never again did she step onto the lawn uninvited. In the days that followed, I noticed something unexpected. The neighborhood felt more connected, more vigilant, and more supportive. Neighbors who had only waved or mumbled hello now exchanged friendly words, checked on each other's lawns, and even left small gestures like watering cans or flower seeds at my gate with notes of encouragement. What had started as a personal stand for my property had transformed into a shared triumph for the whole block. I sat on my porch one evening, watching the sunset cast long golden shadows across the yard. The signs glistened softly in the fading light, the sprinkler quietly resting in its corner, and the camera perched silently like a sentinel. I felt a strange mix of pride, relief, and amusement. Karen had underestimated the power of community, the importance of boundaries, and the strength of a little creativity paired with determination. And yet, in a small corner of my mind, I knew this wasn't just about Karen or even the lawn. It was about setting a precedent, about showing that standing up for yourself respectfully can inspire others to do the same. That's the moment I realized the ultimate victory wasn't the prank, the embarrassment, or even the confrontation, it was the awakening of a community that had been too quiet for too long. By the time dusk settled, the lawn looked as if nothing had ever happened. But the neighborhood had changed. Karen may have thought she could intimidate me, manipulate others, and ignore the rules, but in the end, it was respect, preparation, and a little creativity that won. The story of the sprinkler, the signs, and the camera would be remembered for weeks, a cautionary tale for anyone tempted to disregard boundaries. And for me, it was a personal reminder that sometimes, standing firm in a clever, harmless, and well-thought-out way can turn the tables in ways you never imagined. As I finally went inside that night, I smiled, knowing one thing for certain: Karen would never forget this surprise, the neighborhood would never forget it, and I had learned that a little courage, planning, and community support could achieve more than any argument ever could.